Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Asia Pacific Center of Environmental Law's final webinar of the year on COP27, which seeks to give an overview of the key takeaways with a focus on the developing country perspective. Today, I am very, very honored to have with us three speakers. The first speaker will be my colleague and good friend, Senior Research Fellow at the Asia Pacific Center of Environmental Law, Dr. Linda Yanti Celistiawati. Linda is currently a Senior Research Fellow at the Asia Pacific Center for Environmental Law and is also an Associate Professor of Law at University Gadjah Mada in Indonesia. And we are also very pleased that joining us all the way from Los Angeles, so apologies for the awful time difference, is Professor Rose Lisa Eismer Osoro, who is professor at College of Law at University of Cebu. Professor Rose Lisa is an attorney and professor of law with more than 20 years of experience in natural resources law and regulatory policy. And she recently joined Oceana in the Philippines as its legal and policy director. And the third speaker would be a very dear friend of mine whom I met many years ago, in my first ever environmental law class, Dr. Beatrice Garcia, who is currently senior lecturer at Western Sydney University. Beatrice is kindly joining us all the way from Brazil. So yet another unfriendly time difference. So I'm really glad to both of you for taking the time to join us today. And Beatrice will be speaking third, to offer a perspective on perhaps more from the Latin American perspective, particularly from Brazil, which has had a momentous year. So very, very glad for three speakers. COP27 was hailed as a implementation COP, but it was far from an implementation COP. There were a lot of key decisions. There were a number of key difficult decisions. And the COP also took place against one of the most challenging social and political background that the world has encountered in a long time, against the background of the tension between energy security and climate change commitments because of the war in Ukraine, a cost of living crisis in many developed countries, and uneven post-pandemic recovery across the world. So with this very challenging background, COP27 took place, and it was I'm looking forward to hearing about from our experts their views on how COP27 went in their perspective. And without further ado, I'll hand over the mic to Dr. Linda Celistiawati. Over to you, Linda.
Thanks, Jolene, and thanks everybody to join in. Let me share my screen. Okay. Okay, can you see my screen? Yes. Okay.
Yes.
All right. So thank you for giving me like the first job of COP 27. I think last year, if some of you were also here, we did also a takeaways from COP 26, and with the same panel, and it's a pleasure to do this again this year. But also, you know, a little bit of disappointment because the analysis last year is not, you know, it's not better from the analysis this year, I think, at least from my perspective. So I'm Linda Yanti Celistiawati. I'm a Senior Research Fellow here at APCEL, Asia Pacific Center of Environmental Law in National University of Singapore, and also Associate Professor from Gadjah Mada University, Indonesia. So continuing what Jolene was saying, that COP27 somehow, if COP26 was lukewarm, COP27 was more even more lukewarm. So it reiterates many of the Glasgow Climate Pact goals at COP26, And until the last minute, it doesn't mention broader fossil fuel phase down. So they published the final draft to the public, and even in the final draft, there wasn't, a lot of things that we can really be, proud of. However, the COP it repeats the request that was made at COP26 to revisit and strengthen their NDCs. So up until the COP27 was running, only 25 countries submitted their enhanced NDC, which is, not very great out of 198. So the Pan-African Parliament president iterated that the fossil fuel issues cannot be delivered before other major commitments are delivered, or until we have financed the alternatives. So he's like actually highlighting, if we're not getting alternative support, life support, we can't depart from fossil fuel, which is correct. So at some point, it's good, but on the other point, it's also very bad for the 1.5, right? So a lot of experts say that it's a grave concern, the COP27, because not very many of the countries, the states submitted their enhanced NDC. So the urgency of action to keep 1.5 in reach, that was discussed during informal consultation, didn't really pan out. And there was not a strong language in the end of COP27. And then there's no reference on fossil fuel phase down. So, however, there's one like very huge success that we would like to highlight, that I would like to highlight, is that the loss and damage fund, it was finally agreed in COP27. So although the draft documents that they published didn't include loss and damage, but apparently all the member states didn't give up. And in the final one that they adopted, the loss and damage fund was agreed in COP27. It was by far the most awaited item from COP27. For those of you who are not familiar, the loss and damage fund functions like an insurance policy, compensating developing countries for the losses and damages that climate change events wreak up upon them, especially given that they have contributed significantly less GHG emission than developed countries. So this is not a new thing. We have discussed this long before, even in COP21. So it has been going on for a while. And then finally, they agreed for the fund in 2022. But they just agree for the bucket. They have not agreed on what's inside the bucket and how do we access the bucket, etc. So only the agreement is to establish the fund. So we need to still work on the content of the fund itself and how to access the content for the countries. So for Indonesia, actually, we hosted the G20 meeting in Bali in November. So actually for the whole year, but like the culmination was in November. And I think the language of 1.5 was even stronger in G20 than in COP28. So the G20 leaders agreed to pursue efforts to limit the global temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius, confirming that they stand by the temperature goal from the 2015 Paris Agreement on Climate Change, right? So this was, I think it's very commendable for the presidency of Indonesia in G20 being able to sort of like put this to the world. Okay, this is like the sideline of the summit, the US, Japan, and other partners like Norway and several other countries said that they would mobilize 20 billion US dollars of public and private finance to help Indonesia shut coal power plants and bring forward the sector's peak emission date by 7 years to 2030. So I'm a little bit laughing on this. I'm pretty sure for those of you who are working or sort of familiar with the coal industry would know that the 20 billion US dollars, although it might be big for household money, right? You can be billionaires if you have this in your household, but for coal industry, it's not a very big number. So Indonesia is the second world's biggest coal exporter, and in 6 months, we generate 38 billion US dollars in export earning from coal, and that's in 2021. So when you're saying we give you $20 billion to stop coal power plants, that doesn't even amount of the 6 months that we earn from coal industry. So yeah, so it's a little bit dilemmatic, and we're still thinking, how how are the governments going to make this happen. But bringing forward the net zero emission from 2070 to 2060 or sooner, and now the peak is brought forward to 2030 because like originally the peak was like 2050 or 2056. But if they're working on it, that's probably possible, and changing the coal-fired power plants to something else, to renewable energy. And Indonesia is working very hard for CCS, the carbon capture and storage. Although still in a very, very, very early stage. I'm not quite sure if we can like run for it and then, make everything peak in 2030. Transitioning from cleaner energy sources from coal, right, will reduce Indonesia's emission by 38%. So it's a big chunk of Indonesia energy mix. Like you can see on the screen here, the yellow bright ones are coal, and you can see from 1990 to 2020 that it's all going up, increasing very, very high. Our second biggest problem that I have also presented to you last year is deforestation. So we're still working in deforestation. We pledge a carbon neutrality in 2030, but no firm commitment on deforestation. The government of Indonesia stated that the forest fire fell by 82% in 2020 and rehabilitated some area of mangrove. But I think we need to do more, right? The 82% is hopefully can be maintained or even increased, right? The current administration put a moratorium on clearing primary forests, which contributed to a 45% drop in deforestation within the moratorium area. So now the moratorium is permanent, and it's set by a presidential decree. Our main problem is that within 2 years, we'll have a general election, and we will have a change of administration. And if the administration change, in developing countries, especially like Indonesia, there is a chance that, the presidential decree will be renewed or changed by another presidential decree, but hopefully not. Tackling deforestation will cut Indonesia's emission by 60%. So that's another like very large chunk. So this is I got from the regulatory body of oil and gas in Indonesia. So we want to face down coal and fossil fuels and deforestation, but you can see here on the chart that from 2020 to 2050, there's an increased oil demand projection to 139%, and the increased gas demand projection to 298%. So there's a big, a big increase of all oil, gas, and coal, and The yellow one here, the good news is this is the renewables. So renewables will also increase. So what will be like the strategy of Indonesia to transition to net zero? The first one is renewable energy, obviously. Second one is phasing down fossil fuels. We now have carbon tax and carbon trading regulation ready to be implemented, like very new, like in a matter of months, October 2022. And then co-firing coal plants with renewable energy, and then retirement of coal plants, and then starting CCS and CCUS. Indonesia now holds more than a fifth of the world's nickel, a crucial component of batteries for EV, electric vehicles, and also the world's third largest source of cobalt, another vital input. So the economists suggest that Indonesia will probably be the fourth largest producer of green commodities in the world, behind only Australia, Chile, and Mongolia. So this is our old NDC, 29% with our own efforts and 41% with international support. And this is the president, the current president. And then now the enhanced NDC is 31.89% with like individual effort, and 41 to 43.2% with international support. So NDC is a bottom-up mechanism in the Paris Agreement, but in Indonesia or other developing countries, I'm pretty sure NDC implementation became a top-down, because it's just, the national government set it up and they request local governments and the stakeholders to follow it. It's important to ascertain these new targets are applicable in the local level. So as a conclusion, they're still lukewarm. The COP27 is still lukewarm, no enhanced action. There's too many issues and distraction in COP27, like human rights issue and other things that were pulled into it. And however, they managed to, wrap up and agreed on loss and damage fund, which is great. Some experts think that COP27 was treated as a filler to the upcoming COP28, because most of the global stocktake will happen there. Second NDCs also will be pushed to happen there. There's too much expectation from developing countries and too much unwilling from developed countries, or trying to delay, as usual. I suppose that's it from me. I'm waiting for the question and answer later. I hope all of us are as excited towards all of this process in terms of climate change regulation and implementations in developing countries as it was for me. Thank you, Jolene. Back to you.
Thank you, Linda, for that very insightful perspective from one of the largest or third largest economy in Southeast Asia. I'd like to now invite Professor Rose Leeser to share her presentation. Over to you, Oz.
Thank you, Jolene. Thank you for also to APCEL for also inviting me to this once again to this fireside chat on the COP27 to talk about some of our major takeaways from what just transpired. So I have not prepared any presentation, but I just wanted to share with you some of my thoughts about COP27 and how it the results of this also has implications in the country where I came from, where I come from, the Philippines. So while many consider the establishment of a loss and damage mechanism as a major breakthrough during the COP27, the loss and damage mechanism is, as you may know, is a new fund that will help vulnerable countries like the Philippines pay their rising costs of climate damage from wilder weather and rising seas. But I do agree from most observations that COP27 actually failed to deliver. There were some attempts to reach, an agreement for countries to reach the peak global emission before 2025. and to decide on a clear path to phase down coal use. However, this were not reflected in the final text of the COP27. But we all know that the science is clear. Climate crisis or climate emergencies have been declared, but there is slow progress by governments on ramping up efforts to cut greenhouse gas emissions faster. So that the road that needs to be taken should be the one less traveled, towards sustainability-based future has not been realized. So the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has stated that we cannot carry on a business as usual for oil, gas, and coal. And in fact, this is also reflected in the UNEP production gap report that recommends that a managed phase out beginning with major global north producers must be begun without any delay. Although COP27 was said to have managed to keep the goal of 1.5 degrees, as reaffirmed by the G20 leaders, there's a looming threat, as we have noticed, of greenwashing from the fossil fuel industry, which took the opportunity to dress up natural gas as a climate solution. This seems to be the pivot for the industry that is now more apparent than ever in developing countries like the Philippines. Turning to the Philippines, LNG is now getting a bigger share of the pie of our energy source. It is projected that as compared to 21% in the current energy mix, LNG will account for 26% of gross generation in 2040 in order to meet its energy security targets. The Philippine Energy Plan actually considers LNG as a transition gas and targets the Philippines as an LNG hub for the region. This means that the Philippines will strive to increase the share of its LNG in the next 2 decades. This is actually the government's answer to the dwindling Malampaya gas field supply, which is our major natural gas supply in the Philippines. So to replace Malampaya as a natural gas field, as a source before it runs out, it will begin importation of natural gas by 2023. However, as of present, there are no importation agreements yet, and affordability is the biggest factor considering the Ukraine war. For us, this is also considered as a looming threat. The growing number of LNG gas facilities and terminals are targeted to be built in one of the most ecologically sensitive areas, marine key biodiversity areas in the country, the Verde Island Passage. In fact, the Verde Island Passage is considered as an important part of the Coral Triangle region because it is considered as a center of marine key biodiversity or marine shorefish biodiversity. A total of 11 gas-fired facilities are aimed to be built in this area, and with a very weak environmental impact assessment, governance, and monitoring system, the threats are real for us. The Philippines is also, in fact, a member of the High Ambition Coalition for Nature and People, which seeks to protect at least 30% of the world's land and ocean by 2030. This means that, protecting an area such as the Verde Island Passage, or VIP for short, as we call it, along with other important marine protected areas in the country, cannot be overemphasized. So these are clearly for us mixed signals by the Philippine government. What is more telling in this story is the fact that the Philippine government seems to be delaying its march towards a more renewable energy economy, although it is certainly within our grasp as our renewable energy option policy of the, actually encourages the upward shift towards renewable energy based sources for energy. The country seems to move towards the opposite direction with its increasing focus on LNG as a transition gas. In terms of its current energy security, it remains an elusive goal for the Philippines. In 2020, the country relies on indigenous and imported oil and coal for its total energy supply mix. Its renewable energy potential remains underdeveloped. But the Philippines Philippines bears the brunt of climate impacts. It is considered, in fact, as one of the most vulnerable countries when it comes to climate change impacts. It is visited by a minimum of 20 typhoons each year. And each year, the typhoons are getting more and more stronger, bringing damage to vulnerable communities from north to south part of the country. Thus, the Philippine government had actually high hopes of addressing all these systemic issues before the COP27 negotiations in Egypt began. In fact, prior to the start of the COP27, our Environment Secretary said that the Philippine delegation would press for climate finance and assistance from wealthy nations to help developing countries adapt to the worsening climate disasters in the country. And, the seeming strong signals for a more positive engagement in climate change negotiations, however, began to wane a few days after the COP27 started. In fact, the head of our delegation, the sixth energy secretary and the Climate Change Commission vice chair, was abruptly called back to the Philippines to deal with a more urgent domestic issue, where they consider this as more urgent because this was the Senate deliberations on its agency budget for next year. So the country delegation was actually left without its leading voices in the middle of the negotiations in Egypt, who could have made more impact internationally and domestically when it comes to developing climate policies. So how is the Philippines faring with its NDC? The Philippines has submitted its NDC in April 2021 and committed to a 75 reduction goal by 2030, 2.61% of which is unconditional and 72.29% of which is conditional. It also adopted the National Climate Change Action Plan of 2011 to 2028 for its adaptation efforts. Another relevant international instrument is the Global Methane Initiative, as mentioned by Linda earlier. And the Philippines is also, along with other 109 countries, agreed to take voluntary options or actions to contribute to a collective effort to reduce global methane emissions by at least 30% from 2020 levels by 2030. Needless to say, we need renewable-based energy. Our national policy gives actually preferential treatment to renewable energy expansion by provision for fiscal and non-fiscal incentives for renewable energy projects. So, however, despite all these incentives, we are continued to be hindered by regulatory and infrastructure issues that hinders the expansion towards renewable energy. So our government has to improve its capacities, and other infrastructures in order to admit, or to be able to admit the growing interest in renewable energy sources. So it must find a way, in other words, to expedite the, greater access to renewable energy options. Article 6 of the Paris Agreement allows countries to voluntarily cooperate to reduce emissions, but this has, failed to inspire so far concrete actions. And we had high hopes of this when COP27 began, but it began to wane down as it went along, and until the end of the conference of parties ended in Egypt. So there's no doubt that we need to deal with more pressing issues domestically. However, our Philippine government seems to have lost track of its clear pathway towards achieving a more sustainable future. So this is my last statement. So according to a UN report, we should cut down, the world has to cut down 45% of emissions within 8 years if we were to limit our warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. However, it seems like, time seems to be running out so fast for us, and we need to do more pressing actions so that we can deal with all these pressing issues and impacts of climate change to a country as vulnerable as the Philippines. So for us, there's no time to lose. Thank you so much for giving me this time. I now turn over and back to Jolene.
Thank you very much. And now we will turn the floor to Dr. Beatriz Garcia, who has done some really valuable work working with the indigenous peoples and the Amazon region. I've always had great admiration for Beatriz's work, which really tries to just go beyond the theory and the academic discourse, and to really trying to put her work into practice for the benefit of the communities that she really feels deserve that attention. So over to you, Beatriz.
Thank you so much, Jolene, for the beautiful words. Thank you for the invitation, and APCEL as well. It's an honor for me to be here with very dear colleagues and friends. We have been together last year discussing COP26. I think this Global South Alliance is becoming a tradition. I'm very glad to be here again. I also thank you all who are listening and participating in this discussion today. So I'll start sharing some thoughts here with you. Right, so about the outcomes of COP27, particularly in relation to forests, and bring some insights about what is happening in Brazil. So as you know, COP27 discussed many issues. Here are some of them. Climate finance, financing loss and damage being probably the most prominent topic discussed in this COP, but we also had discussions on decarbonization of key industries, on transition to clean energy patterns. But I will now talk a little more about what are the outcomes for forest and land use. Right, so as you all know, there is a very close link between forests and climate change. Forests cover 31% of the planet's land surface, but we are losing forests very quickly. So between 1990 and 2020, we have lost 420 million hectares of forests through deforestation. And if we stopped clearing forests, we would be avoiding emissions of 3.6 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent per year. This would be certainly a big help for us to try to keep the global temperature below 1.5 degrees Celsius. Right, so as you can see here, in the action implementation plan of COP27, we again recognize that role that forests have in climate mitigation. This is again another recognition of that close link, right? So now I will pass on to the some of the good news and pledges that have been made in relation to forests. Probably a big one, good news, is that Brazil is back in business. So we heard the speech of the Brazilian president-elect Lula, and he says that destruction will stay in the past. Climate change will be among the highest priorities of his administration. This was wonderful to hear. And just to give you some scenario, what we had before him, as you may have heard, with the Bolsonaro government, we had a 6% increase in Amazon deforestation compared to the previous government. Deforestation in the Amazon accounted for 77% of emissions from land use change in 2021. And overall, Brazil's emissions have had the highest increase in 19 years during this administration. So this is the legacy of the Bolsonaro government. Right. So back to the good news. What happened in COP27 was an important announcement and alliance between the largest rainforest countries, Brazil, Indonesia, and Congo, that they would be joining forces and calling for a new payment mechanisms to preserve tropical rainforests and regulate climate. That's one good announcement made during at COP27. Also, soon after Lula was elected in Brazil, both Norway and Germany announced that they would resume allocation of resources for the Amazon Fund. And the Amazon Fund has provided essential support for REDD+ activities in the Brazilian Amazon for sustainable conservation, sustainable use projects. So this will be back in operation. This was announcement made just after Lula was elected. I also wanted to call your attention to some mechanisms and decisions that are being discussed and negotiated under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. So under Article 6, there has been discussion on both market and non-market mechanisms that will be used basically to help the parties under the Paris Agreement for them to cooperate in the implementation of their NDCs, right? So these mechanisms will be also applicable in the forestry sector. I also wanted to call your attention here to Article 6, paragraph 2 of Paris Agreement, which really brings the seeds of a global carbon market, and decisions have been taken in relation to this article in particular. So to give you an overview here, these are some of those decisions that have been adopted under the umbrella of Article 6, and they have been happening since COP26 already, right? So they are all very relevant for the forestry sector and other sectors as well. And now a few more words about thinking of Article 6.2 in particular and the promise of carbon markets. What we have noticed since COP26 with these decisions being made in relation to future carbon markets, what we notice is that there is an increased interest in forest carbon projects, in the voluntary market also. And I just wanted to share with you my experience from being here in Brazil in the last few months. I've been here on sabbatical. As Jolene said, work with indigenous communities here in the Brazilian Amazon. And what we see happening is that there are carbon companies, investors coming to those communities, knocking their doors, bringing whole contracts, all written, promising millions of dollars. And it's just very hard for those communities to understand what it is. So I had the chance of participating in training workshops with those communities to explain them what carbon markets what are the legal and technical requirements of these markets, and with indigenous communities, and they tell me that everything is very complicated. Even understanding the words is complicated. For example, they don't understand what carbon is. There's no such word in their native languages. So everything is very complicated. So this is just to illustrate how difficult it can be to implement those very complex, complicated mechanisms when we have communities that have very little knowledge, sometimes don't speak the language. Many of those communities in the Brazilian Amazon don't speak Portuguese. So we do need to have very strong safeguards and enforce those safeguards so that we can protect rights of indigenous communities properly. Right, so to sum up some of my reflections on COP27, I think that Brazil being back on the world stage was a big highlight of COP27, but Lula will face a lot of opposition in parliament. There is a very strong Bolsonarism in Brazil, and he will also have to fight established organized crime in the Amazon. The new Rainforest Alliance with Brazil, Congo, and Indonesia is very promising, but we need targeted actions and funding to make things work. And also in relation to those decisions that I was talking about, both market and non-market mechanisms under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, all these mechanisms may raise funding for forest conservation, but if overly complicated or poorly implemented, they will not help communities or the climate. So thank you so much again for the opportunity. I look forward to your comments and questions. And again, it was a pleasure to be here with you. Thank you, Jolene.
Thank you very much, Beatrice. And on the sobering note of the need to ensure environmental integrity and making sure that climate solutions really do work for the local communities as well. So we have a couple of questions in our Q&A. And so let me start first with, I guess I'll go in order of the questions as they have appeared in the Q&A. And the first question comes, so the first question is on the controversial question of who pays for loss and damage. And the question is, do you think that Singapore, as an official developing country under the UN, and which also prefers to preserve that developing country label, should pay for loss and damage? And I've already taken a first crack at the question in the Q&A, but for the purposes of the audience who are joining us, who would be listening to the video recording eventually or maybe not, I'll just read out my preliminary answer and then open it up for discussion. So my preliminary answer to that question was, thank you for your question. Under the Kyoto Protocol, Singapore was a non-Annex 1 country and therefore could be said to fall within the category of countries that exclude developed countries and economies in transition. This is a convoluted way of stating the case, but it is intentionally so, because the dichotomy between developed and developing was a very controversial and contentious issue under the Kyoto Protocol. However, under the Paris Agreement, which came into force in 2015, this distinction for the purposes of climate change commitments does not quite hold. Further, Singapore does not claim to have developing country status in the climate negotiations under the Paris Agreement, and I'm happy to elaborate more. But I would like to throw the question out more broadly, actually, the question of who should pay for loss and damage. And why is this an issue? Because for those who wonder why almost at every COP, this has become a bit of a rallying cry, not necessarily under the rubric of loss and damage, but under the rubric of who should pay for the for adaptation, for example, and then now with loss and damage. And I'll just start with Linda, then I'll go to Oz and then to Beatrice, and then can hear your views on this if you have any to share. Over to you, Linda.
Thanks, Jolene. I think, yeah, so the question has been asked, I think, since the beginning of COP, right? Because somebody needs to provide for all this financial assistance and technological transfers, you know, from the west to the east, from the north to the south, etc. And I think Annex 1 country, of course, from Kyoto Protocol should be responsible, and also economics in transition. And this is, you know, this includes those countries that are not in the Annex 1, but having the means to do so. You know, like huge economies, including like China, for example. They are still a developing country, but they, you know, their power exceeds almost all of the developing countries. I agree with Jolene, like the Paris Agreement also gives us the liberty to do so, like requesting this transition economy to also help with the efforts that are being pursued by the agreement. So specifically for loss and damage, my highlight would be, developed countries and countries that has the means to do so would have to give the money right away, because this is not like adaptation or mitigation fund where you have time to make the proposal and put it in and wait for 1 year and get approval from. These are countries that are already in emergency, and the funds need to be ready right away. Like, you don't want to wait for a year, because within 1 year, countries like Vanuatu, for example, would already be gone. So, underwater. So I think this is also, we need to sort of just establish the fund, and then the technicalities of it, and just being able to spread the funds to countries that really, really need this.
I have a follow-up question from the audience, and it is related. So I'm going to put it out there so that we can answer it together on this issue of loss and damage. So the question is, with the $100 billion commitment to adaptation from developed countries not having been met, do you think the loss and damage fund would be any different? Quick answer, one sentence, if possible.
Me?
Well, with you first, one sentence, and then we'll go off to Oz and Beatrice.
Yeah. So with very strong pressures from us outside the system, I would say yes, because this is very urgent.
Thank you for your optimistic reply, Linda. Oz, over to you.
Very complicated questions, but yeah. Well, for me, the loss and damage fund was seen as I see this as a positive step towards climate justice. And for me, it isn't any question that the developed countries or economies that have better conditions than developing countries, and those underdeveloped countries should pay for this. And I don't know the dichotomy of the different countries, but I guess what is the emphasis that I'd like to place on this loss and damage fund is that, well, there's some optimism with regard to this, but also I would like to also be more cautious about this, because it seems like focus on this would be a focus only on creating a fund without focusing on the need to move faster in order to slash greenhouse gas emissions. And so some even calls this fund as the fund for the end of the world, because it seems like they just would pay for it and then continue ignoring the need for cutting down on greenhouse gas emissions. But it's really important to really put that cautious note out there when it comes to this loss and damage fund.
Thanks, Oz. Beatrice?
Look, I think the loss and damage fund was definitely a very positive outcome of COP27. At some point, I thought it was not going to happen. So I think that is already a positive. It does put in practice the principle of common but differentiated responsibility. But I think the two main questions are, will there be enough fund for all that is needed? And also what Linda was saying, will funding be available quickly enough? Because there are so many needs and so much urgency. So I think these are the main issues that the fund has to deal with.
Thank you very much. No, well, at least the highlight is it's founded, and as Linda put it, at least there is a bucket. We'll have to fill the bucket, but at least there is a bucket. That was not so clear there would be a bucket. Well, we are hopeless optimists, aren't we, as environmentalists? Linda, we have a question directly for you. The question is, do you think that the omnibus law that has been passed recently in the Indonesian parliament will derail the achievements of the moratorium on plantation expansion?
Okay, so for those of you who are not familiar, Indonesia enacted an omnibus law in 2021, and this law sort of revised and remanded 78 other previous laws, and this of course includes ones that are dealing with environment and forestry and deforestation, etc. And for example, it cuts down the conservation areas of riverbed and in riverbeds and in islands. It cuts down buffer areas in lakes. It sort of gives permission to convert forest into food estates projects, and million other things. And would that influence the moratorium for primary forest directly? I think not, but in the long run, would that influence deforestation and forest degradation? Making it faster to happen? I would say yes. So yeah, it's not easy to balance investment needs, development needs with environmental conservation. But I do think this omnibus law is sort of like heavier into the development needs than environmental needs in several respects. So that's my answer.
Thank you very much, Linda. We have here a few questions and comments from Luz Abanyan of Child Rights Coalition Asia. And what I'll do is just basically to summarize it as a question. And thank you very much also for your comments, Luz, about the dangers that environmental rights defenders face in countries like Philippines, Indonesia, and Latin America in the region. So the question from Luz is, given the impact of climate change, the adverse impacts on climate change on children's rights, what do you think should civil society organizations working to protect human rights and children's rights, what can they do to realize a more inclusive COP28, as well as other, regional and international forums, and for example, anything specific to loss and damage for children? I'll start actually from the back, from Beatrice.
That's a very, very interesting question. I'm not sure if I am the right person to answer, but I think we see children, young people taking such an important stage in those discussions. I don't know if you've seen, for example, some indigenous young women coming to COP27, and some of them were saying, it's not a question of choice for me to be here. I have to be here. It's like almost a matter of survival. I think it's the same rationale for young people, for children, right? That's the world that they'll have to deal with in the future. So with this rationale, I think it is true that they should have a very dedicated space in those COPs, but not only that, they should really be heard. So I think we should probably have to think of mechanisms in which those young voices would really have some weight in those decisions, not only make noise, but also be taken into account. So that's definitely a question that I think we should be working much more, I think, in the future.
Thank you. And Oz, do you have any views about how children's rights or the voices of children can be better reflected in international negotiations?
For me, there are two ways. Seeing from our experience here in the Philippines. Before the Philippine delegation went to Egypt, they actually conducted a consultation among civil society organizations, and so we were all able to air out, our views and ideas about how to present our position as as a country to the Philippine delegation. So that's one way. And then the other way is, of course, I'm happy to also share that several youth groups from the country was actually able to submit a statement during the conference. So, the youth is getting more and more engaged and active in these conferences. And so I don't see any doubt that they can play a more important role in the conference and in the future. So I know they're we should look out for them, but I think they're able to do that themselves already, and at this point in time, and they know that what is at stake is for them to have a livable future, and so I think that's why they are very, very much more engaged in these negotiations, in these conferences.
Thank you very much. I think we have time for just one last question. And I think the question that I would try to take, given that we have just limited time, will be the question of accountability. What accountability mechanisms are there to ensure that governments receiving funds are actually using it for the intended purpose, for example, adaptation or loss and damage? Perhaps over to you first, Linda.
Thank you for the question. I think this is very important, like in terms of accountability of the funds that were received from state parties are used for exactly the things that they said they were going to use. Reporting, monitoring, verification, MRV, monitoring, reporting, and verification is one of the methodologies that are highlighted very clearly in the Paris Agreement. So, and that includes also, how you use the funding and disperse that. I think if you receive anything from the GCF, the Green Climate Fund would already also have like very clear methodology on how you use it, and they also have the MRV system, and also for adaptation funds and mitigation fund, and now loss and damage fund. Nationally, I think that's the problem. Like when you are talking about our developing countries, like for my country, Indonesia, for example, we try our best to sort of make the spending and receiving and spending transparent, and we appoint like a specific body to arrange this and report this to the agreement. However, with 548 localities, cities and municipalities in the country, and the gap of capacity, human capacity, and also infrastructure capacity, asking them to do exactly what the agreement wanted them to report would be a problem. So of course, like these things, there will be hindrance in many loopholes. but we're hoping the national governments, wherever they are in the countries, in the developing countries, would be able to manage that, with respect to the MRV system that is requested.
Thank you, Linda. And Beatrice, anything that you would like to add?
Yeah, just to add, I know there are systemic issues, especially for developing countries like Philippines, Indonesia, and other countries. I know this sounds familiar, but traditional watchdogs for transparency and accountability mechanisms are present in these countries. But I guess I think it's also important to emphasize the role of civil society organizations, again, to provide the accountability mechanism, the transparency mechanisms, and so there has to be collaboration, cooperation by the governments, the Philippine government together with civil society organizations. So there should have be the ability for us to cooperate and ensure that there are transparency mechanisms in place.
Thank you very much, Oz, for reminding us that civil society organizations play an important role in keeping governments and corporations in check. Beatrice?
Yes, I share the concerns that you have raised before. So in terms of mechanisms, again, it's reporting, monitoring, and verification. And given the nature and difficulties of our countries, I would say that monitoring and verification have a very important role in this process of ensuring that things are really working. And that's for sure that civil society in countries such as Brazil, for example, they play a very, very, very big role in ensuring that things are happening. So they have a very, very important role, and they will continue to have, and I think that's the same situation in other countries as well.
Thank you very much. Well, it leaves me now to close the webinar. Thank you very much for joining us this Friday morning in Asia, and it's night now for us and Beatrice. And I'm sure you will join me virtually in thanking our speakers for sharing with us their expertise, their knowledge, and their thoughts. Thank you very much. And I have been told to remind everyone that there is a survey. Please scan the QR code to complete the survey, and the link is also available in the chat box. Thank you very much, and we hope to see you again soon.